Well, a couple more people have wandered into this room, hopefully fully aware that they're in the right room. And we've had a few more join in the participant list here. I don't know, what do you think, Antoine? Should we get started? All right. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Registration Protocols Extensions Working Group. Very glad to have you here. We have our co-chairs both present here at this meeting. I'm sitting at the table. I'm Jim Galvin and Antoine Verschuren. You can see the giant head on the screen over there on the other side. So thanks everyone. We only have an hour today. We do have a couple of discussion topics, one which might be a little bit lengthy, but we'll just jump through our details here. So let's see. Let's just move forward one in the slides. This is the standard note well. Everyone should be very well familiar with it by now. Even if you're a newcomer, you surely have been to a meeting before this one. So I won't really belabor this point. Also, just a reminder, we now have a whole set of code of conduct and guidelines. And a reminder, treating each other with respect and speaking slowly and limit the use of slang. A couple of important things to put up there. But also like to take this opportunity to remind people that everything is recorded here. Make sure that you're aware of that and keep that in mind when you're speaking. To participate in the room, you can use the QR code, which is not on the screen anymore, but I believe it's on the back of a couple of chairs. You surely know all of that by now. And in any case, you can go to the agenda, the full agenda page. And for each individual meeting, there is an icon over there on the right on the line for choosing to join the meeting room. You must join the meeting room, at least at the local tool to speak, please, so that you can properly get yourself in the queue, put your hand up, and we'll call on people to come up to the mic. You'll see the queue list. You can, one extra person can stand up behind whoever's speaking just to keep things moving along, but we're going to try not to crowd folks as much as possible. And yes, the important thing about signing into the room is, of course, it's the blue sheet reference, and that's where all of that comes from. So thanks for that. And last point here is masks are required unless you are speaking at the microphone, and strictly speaking, I guess I can wear mine. It's supposed to work just fine even at these mics, right? People have had some issues at the mics in the center of the room. So the reminder is to please make sure to get very close to the microphone. Please do eat the microphone and speak in a normal or slightly above voice so that your sound can carry into the room properly. All right, thanks very much. And I can see that everyone in this room has a mask on, and we appreciate that. All right, here's our agenda for today. It's a pretty pro forma agenda. It's what we normally do, so we'll just kind of zip through some things here pretty quickly. We've kind of already been into the welcome and introductions, and we've covered the note well. Just a reminder in general that we very much like, we're trying very hard to move forward with document management and reviewers. We have been trying to make sure that although this is a low volume group and not a very significant set of people, we're trying very hard to make sure we have at least 5 independent people who acknowledge that a document should move forward when we're looking for that during last call. And we're also trying to be in a place where we get document shepherds early in the process of a document, if not at the moment it's adopted, preferably. We've just had some issues with that going along. So just trying to make sure we get all of that along the way, and appreciate your help in that respect. Finally, we do need a minutes taker, someone to take notes. I know that someone has graciously already put a copy of the agenda there. Is there anyone who would be willing to volunteer to step up and take some notes? Okay, so we just see Rick here in the front row, so thank you very much to Rick Wilhelm. You know, our notes taking is not as complex as some of the other groups, you know, fairly straightforward, just collecting some bullet point summaries and actions, of course, alongside the agenda that's already in there. So appreciate that, Rick. Thanks much. Okay. So let's move to a look at the documents we published since the last time. Sadly, none. But I expect a banner year to be coming up as we move along here. We have quite a few documents that are very close to the end. And we also have, moving along here, we have a document in particular, one that is currently with the IESG. We have our internationalized email addresses in EPP extension. There's been quite some discussion in the IETF last call. I think this is probably our first document that has really gotten this much attention in the community at large. So that's much appreciated by the rest of the IETF. We've certainly had the folks who are much more expert in internationalization issues who've paid a lot of attention to this. I think it's in a pretty good place. I'm not going to walk through all of the issues that have been discussed, but thank you to the document authors and the document shepherd, you know, who've been carefully tracking all of these things and making sure that all the details are covered. And I believe the document is getting very close to being released from the IESG, that all the issues have been, I think all the issues have actually been acknowledged at this point and taken care of. So I expect the IESG will do its final due diligence and that'll move along into the RFC editor queue. So that's a good thing. No material issues that had to be handed back to us to address. So yay for us. Okay, and with that, we're going to move to walking through a few of our other documents and status of existing work. And I'm going to turn this back over to Antoine, who's going to walk us through the rest of this. Antoine, if you want to just take over the slides there.
You have to do that for me, right? Ah, you just remove them. Okay, I'll open them again. No problem.
Yeah.
So here they are again, and I think this is where we were going, right? And you can all hear me. So this one you already did. Okay, existing work, no presentations. Well, the first one, of course, is simple registration reporting. It's still in our queue. So I take over the chair role, but Jim, do you have anything to say about your document?
No, thanks to Jim Gould, who provided some detailed comments. We provided a revised document, and we're just frankly kind of holding back at the moment because there are other documents that are kind of in front of it rather than pressing on getting it published. But no new significant updates at the moment, and we expect that we'll move that along as soon as something else moves up into the queue first. Thanks.
Okay, great. Then we have existing work with discussions and documents, and we have a document registration data dictionary. Heather is going to talk about that. So Heather, I will take up your slides. Do you want to have the control yourself, or do you want me to progress the slides?
There's only two substantive slides, so
exactly.
You might as well just keep holding on. All right, okay. Next slide, please. All right, so we've been slowly updating this draft, and the main feedback we've received, there's sort of two camps here. One is there's some folks that have an ongoing concern that the draft will drive policy, which is not what it's intended to do, but there's a concern that it will just by its existence. That said, there is support from, for example, the RIR space. Folks I talked to on that side of the world said, you know, they saw some potential overlap with some existing work, but there was value here that they could see having a data dictionary of common terms would be helpful. So what we're thinking is, with this draft, this is, if you're going to do something, if you're going to be using terms, and the IETF is where you take that to say, here's how you do it. But we're really not trying to set the policy here. So I'm looking for feedback as to, is there any language that we can add that would relieve some of that concern? I'm proposing to add some additional text to the introduction and abstract, being very explicit that this is not intended to promote policy development. It is intended to be broadly applicable. This is not just for, of course, the ICANN contracted parties. It's supposed to be for RIRs, CCTLDs, really anyone working in registration space. There are a couple areas in the document that, if you could go to the next slide, please, that still need some definition. And that's really the next thrust of work that we'll be doing between now and the next IETF meeting. If you have thoughts, feedback, commentary, both on the question of how to relieve the policy concern and definitions to put for these TBD items, I'd love to hear your feedback. Steve, is there anything you would like to add?
There was something that was occurring to me, and then it went away, and I'm hoping it comes back momentarily. So let's see if we can get anybody else to engage while I recover the thought that I was going to share.
Okay, we have a question from Richard. Richard, go ahead, please.
Sure, thanks.
Rick
PIR. So I'm one of the folks, although I haven't put this on the list, that this document really is not helpful for ICANN contracted parties, whether they be registrars or registries, because the terms that it defines overlap strongly with terms that are defined in registrars and registries contracts. And frequently, ICANN refers to RFCs as a way to anchor things in the technical realm. And the concern that this is going to be that kind of a document is going to be hard to get away from, especially when it defines things that are not necessarily as technical, and it's a data dictionary. So I don't know what really to do about that, other than to maybe limit the scope of the things that are defined. Also, there's overlap with other documents, but I think that's one's already been brought up. Thank you.
Can I offer two comments? As you noted, ICANN frequently refers to RFCs as a source to draw from in their definitions. This is intended to be exactly in that line. It's the awkwardness that I think you're implicitly talking about is that these definitions had not existed in RFC form before ICANN started putting these into contracts. Ideally, all the terms would be all the terms that ICANN is interested in would be aligned, and in any case, as is always the case for IETF documents, that there's no force behind them. They're adopted or used or referenced as people find them useful to do that. So there's a very sharp division between trying to have a neutral, external, generally useful set of definitions, and then how any group, whether it's ICANN or any other group that implements things, makes use of those. So that's one comment that I wanted to offer up, and it's genuinely not intended at all to be driving ICANN policy. It's intended to actually provide a, if you look at it from an ICANN perspective, a more solid basis for the references for the terms that they use. Separate point. We've envisioned and expect that when this dictionary is put together, that it's accompanied by a suitable set of experts that then are the I don't want to make it sound like control, but are the source of expertise and sanity with respect to new terms that get added or raising questions about whether there's conflict between, two different terms that mean the same thing and such. So, Heather and I are neither of us are volunteering to be part of that expert group, but one of the things that has to be done downstream at some point, wherever it's appropriate in the process, is to find volunteers from the community who are willing to be part of that.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And Richard, you have another comment to make?
Yes, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
So thanks for that, Steve. I appreciate the feedback and comment. It's precisely the variability of the dictionary and the fact that it's going to be starting to be leaned on by contracts that makes it unsuitable, because the contracted parties can't have the definition of what a registration is be open for interpretation by an expert group. The contracts need firm language upon which to be built, and having these kind of definitions that are contractually important be rested in an RFC that's open to malleability by an expert group, no matter how expert they are, is not the kind of contractual certainty that contracted parties can live with. And so while I understand that it may be interesting and useful for a population of certain groups, a key constituency in this whole thing are the ICANN contracted parties, and this makes their lives, their contractual lives, much more difficult than the benefit that it gives, I would offer. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're putting way too much emphasis on the role that this dictionary would play. I mean, to take simple examples, where it says name, there's, I don't know what the contractual issues and definitions that you have in mind in the ICANN contracts that would have any issue about what a name means. But I think we're going sort of imagining more force than is intended there. Also, the ICANN contracts, although they cover half of the world of the domain name system, they don't cover the other half, and they don't cover the numbers community. And so if one wants to think in terms of whether or not the fields that are defined might be common across the entire spectrum, then the question is, how do you get there? The IETF is the place. ICANN doesn't do that.
Or in other words, Steve, I think, when it looks like a car, when it smells like a car, when it sounds like a car, it's probably a car, right?
Yes, but I didn't quite understand which word you were using. It looks like, smells like a what?
A car.
A gar?
Or domain name.
An automobile.
Or the address, or whatever.
See,
Or a
I
name.
see. Yeah.
All right.
Okay, Rick,
think
go
that-
ahead.
One more point, just to kind of, this is serious business, our talk about cars and ducks,
Yeah.
notwithstanding. Just to bring the point home, the contracted parties, when we're working with RFCs, we are very careful about which URLs we use. So as the URLs that go into the contracts are the actual firm URLs, that the URLs can't be variable in later spots, that we nail down the actual reference URLs with the text, that they can't later refer to something else. So the contracted parties' contracts are serious business. They incorporate and reference RFCs for very important things because the IETF makes important contributions to those things. Their firmness and their quality is important. And when we've got something like this, it's a data dictionary that could be moving underneath, that could be incorporated in the future, it sets a bad situation up for the ICANN contracted parties, precisely because the IETF RFCs have such standing. So it's not to denigrate the RFCs, it's I'm pointing out the fact that they carry a lot of weight in the ICANN community. Thank you.
Yeah, but the point is exactly to nail these down and put them in a solid position. We're talking about an IANA managed registry that is intended to have exactly the solidity that you're talking about and not be mangled or changed arbitrarily over time. It's the same as any other protocol definitions. You need them to be quite stable.
Can I, George Michelson, APNet, can I talk briefly to this? I actually have a great deal of sympathy to the problem a contracted party would have in this space, and I don't think your response from PIR is silly in any sense at all. I think this is a rational response. But I wanted to observe the nature of an RFC is that post-publication, they are substantively immutable. And were there subsequent change to a data dictionary, we might call it a 9999 biz process in draft, but when it's published, the number it gets will not be 9999. It can't be. The nature of the document is that it becomes an immutable state of the data dictionary at the time it is published. But your substantive point about the contractual and legal issues, I think that's a genuine concern. I think you're right to air it, but I don't think the mutability of the DD is material, because if you embedded a URL ref, it would embed to the historically consistent state. That was my only point.
Thank you, George. Very well stated. And it reminds me of, since I invented the RFCs 50 years ago as genuinely requests for comments, I've observed that we passed the 1984 mark of George Orwell, and that the words don't mean anything like what they used to mean. Comments are no longer requested by the time an RFC is published.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And I wanted to say to Rico as well, my remark was not so more about that. Perhaps, Steve, you might be able to explain what the experts are supposed to do. Are they going to change any of the definitions that are in the data dictionary, or do you envision that they are, reviewing new additions for new terms that need to go into the data dictionary?
Well, the essential role is on the latter, as gatekeepers and curators and managers of sanity for new entries, and to make sure things remain stable, not to go fiddling around.
That was also my thought, and hence I thought, when there is a definition, the definition remains stable. Otherwise, it's no sense to make a definition, right?
Precisely.
Exactly. Okay. Any other questions on this document? If not, then thank you, Heather, and thank you, Steve. And I will go to the next slide. Let's first put up the share slides again.
Thank you.
Okay, so that was existing work discussion, and then we come to, I think, the major part of our discussion here today will be about the RDAP extensions and identifier conformance. As most of you have seen, there has been quite some discussion on the mailing list recently about this topic. Firstly, I want to apologize for not entering the discussion immediately. I had a pretty long vacation, so I had to read it all back, and it was quite a lot. and I think many people have had the same issues. The result of the discussion was that we have 4 RDEF documents which are being held back by the outcome of the discussion. So Jim and I thought it would be useful to have a summary of the discussion and try to resolve it here and discuss anything about the extension identifier and RDEF conformance. And we have a presentation for that, and Jim has done a great job in some summary. So I will give the word to Jim. You brought them up already yourself, so you can control them. So go ahead and try to explain the discussions that we had.
Okay, thanks very much, Antoine. Yeah, there has been quite some discussion on the mailing list about this work and about the issue. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to very briefly just kind of look at a summary of the discussion that happened. I'm sure that most of you have already looked at the slides here, so you know what the punchline is. I think the most important thing to say is that we're not really going to try to review the technical merits of any one of the proposals or another. So we're going to come at this from a slightly different direction, look again a bit at the problem that we think we're trying to solve here, and we're going to put a proposal forward. So this is just a chair's proposal for you know, how to proceed and where to go from here. And so we'd like to focus the discussion on our proposal, not on the technical merits of one option or another and the path forward. So with that in mind, this slide really is, I owe thanks to Jazip Singh, who actually produced a document, a multi-page document, where he did quite the technical analysis, a summary of all of the issues. I want to thank him for that. I just kind of picked out a few things here just to put it in for the historical record so that we could all see what's there. Again, I really don't want to dwell on the various technical merits of these different things, except to say that, frankly, there really isn't anything wrong with any one of them. You know, if we were starting from scratch, I think that all 3 of these are perfectly valid paths forward, and we'd be having a slightly different discussion. We'd want to dig in a little more on the technical merits of the differences between these things so that we could think more about what our future looks like from today, as opposed to what was done, you know, when EPP was created, and looking forward and how it put things out there. So our particular choice here and the proposal that we're going to get to is not intended to undermine any one of these options. I think they're all good choices. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, but you know, we're gonna move on from that at the moment. Okay. You know, and clearly the other thing to keep in mind is that we're a relatively small group. Really, those who are very active in these discussions really are all experts, and so the opinions about each of these individual options are very solid and stable opinions. You know, I mean, these are people who really, you know, do command the respect that they've earned in presenting these options and talking about them. But as chairs, the problem that we're faced is we don't have consensus, which is kind of interesting. In our group, consensus usually means just finding 3 to 5 solid people who are not an author of the document or otherwise engaged with its movement, who agree or don't, you know, or at least explicitly don't have any objection to it. And we don't even have that. It's clear that we've got, you know, the people who we would normally turn to help steer the group in a single direction are all on different sides of this. So on the one hand, you know, what we have here is a technical problem, but we have an internet standard that has a defined solution for what we're doing. We can certainly, you know, have some discussion about how clearly defined all of that was. But what the chairs are putting forward here is, given that we have an internet standard, we really do have to fall back on the process point of there's a pretty high bar for changing what already exists. There has to be. By definition, that's what it means to be an internet standard. So, with respect to these options, we got to thinking about, okay, well, if that's the case, then, what do these things look like against the standard that's already there? And we took a step back to ask ourselves, what problem are we really trying to solve? Want to call out a couple of specific sections which have appeared on the mailing list. I believe Scott Hollenbeck called out both of these sections as part of the discussion. But in any case, in the RDAP RFCs, the first one in the series in the extensions does talk about the fact that the RDAP identifier itself, the extension identifier for RDAP in the registry should be unique against all other identifiers. And so that becomes, in our mind, as we look at how to think about these things, the critical characteristic that we're looking for in defining extensions, in any extension in RDAP. And another thing is in 9083, which is the response specification, which talks about responses look like, it also explicitly talks about what goes in the RDAP conformance is a unique string that's a literal value in the RDAP extension registry. So all of these things, keep us to a first principle of uniqueness. Whatever identifier is there, that is the principle by which we started. That's where we were when we started, and that's really where we should stay. And so the question is, have we really motivated wanting to change that particular property? We're also sort of mixed on this issue of what's your metric for evaluation of some of these changes. A lot of the discussion we've noticed focuses on programming as a metric for which option to choose. Some things require more programming work than other things. Taking a step back, and maybe this is just our point of view, but it's certainly, I'll say for myself, it represents my experience over time in the IETF. Programming is not really the first order metric. That's not to say the complexity is not important, but what we really care about is protocol behavior and protocol performance. I mean, to a large extent, programming is a one-off thing, right? Once you figure out what you want to do, you put whatever effort you have to into the programming, and then you move on. So, judging a particular option based on the amount of effort to get it right doesn't feel like the right metric. You're really more concerned with how it's all going to behave and how it comes together. So in the end, what we think is, have we created a problem? Is there a problem out there that does something different in terms of the first principles of uniqueness and optionality? We think that extensions in general have to have those two characteristics. Those are the things which are most important in this space. And in deciding, whether or not to change into any one of these options, the question is there a problem that exists that is beyond what these two properties actually provide? Okay, so have we found a bar that we've crossed in order to change the standard? Because we believe the standard has those two critical properties, and these options really don't have those two properties in the same way. All right, so what is our particular suggestion here? Focusing on the fact that we want to keep the uniqueness and optionality, and we also think that simplicity is preferred, then the observation we make is these discussions about the options are about finding some way to version extensions and supporting a versioning option of some sort in the extensions. And it is our belief here and our assertion that support for versioning is not an integral part of the base standard. It's not part of RDAP as defined. And while it might be interesting to solve that problem as part of, our working group here, we honestly have not heard, we don't believe any of the options have motivated the need for changing that particular characteristic. Focusing on uniqueness and optionality, versioning is not part of those two things. It's a different thing entirely. And that wasn't covered in the base spec. It's just not present and not intended to be there. Now, we do observe that certainly you could choose to provide optioning inside of your extension definition if you're so inclined. Arguably, option 3 in that list is kind of like that. Option 3 is essentially describing a mechanism whereby an extension itself could decide in its own specification to provide a means for versioning. That would be fine. You know, I mean, that's an independent object. It can do what it wants to do and can see if it gets traction in. But it doesn't feel like something that should rise to the level of being handled by the extension registry. And it doesn't rise to the level of something that should be handled by the RDAP protocol itself at that level. And so that's the observation that we make. And, you know, that really is the point. So I think that, you know, what we're proposing is probably closest to option one. But in principle, you know, we just want to focus on the fact that none of these options really, you know, they haven't motivated a change to a full internet standard. And so we believe that versioning is not something that's covered, and we should not open that door and open that topic in this working group at this time. That trying to challenge the base specification doesn't, we haven't got consensus to do that, not at all. There's been no technical motivation for doing that. And so that is our response to all of that discussion. Not sure how that's gonna sit with people, give people a chance to think about that a bit more. I've added a little bit of color. Oh, we do have someone in the queue here, so let's take that question. So Jim Gould, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good, thank you. Well, first off, I wanted to say I appreciate the passionate debate on the list. It's I really enjoyed it, and I want to appreciate the work that the chairs did in coming up with this proposal. I know it's difficult, and I can get behind it. I do have a couple caveats that I want to point out that I really believe that versioning is an important element that we should look to add in the future in some way. So that may be something for us to look for the opportunity to do so. The other is that we do need to support versioning of policy identifiers. For example, the RDAP profile identifiers. Versioning in those scenarios are important. They're not extensions with actual elements of an extension. So I want to ensure that that version can continue to be supported in the extension registry. So that's it. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jim. Appreciate the comment. Under the second bullet here, even on this slide, the second bullet under the second bullet, where you make the observation that, you know, there probably is an opportunity for additional clarity regarding versioning. I put it there on the slide when Antoine and I were talking and left it as kind of a question mark, because whereas the change of the LunarNIC level 0 to just LunarNIC really isn't a RADA change, and that's a fairly straightforward and easy thing to do, it's not clear that this is a straightforward and easy thing to do. So Jim, you just brought up the issue that versioning is something that we should approach and you know, pay more attention to and bring it as a topic forward. And I certainly don't object to that. I agree. It's certainly a technical topic within the context and within scope for this working group. So you know, there's an opportunity there if someone wants to press on that and have that discussion. And it is related to this question. You know, should we have some additional clarity regarding versioning? I don't know. We were looking, Antoine and I, trying to decide if there was an editorial point somewhere along the way where we could add some changes that might make this a little more clear, but it just started getting really kind of uncertain. I felt like we were crossing a line between editorial and material, and figured it was really a question to bring back to the group here. I mean, if there's interest, I think I'd like to see us do that as a working group, but I don't want to force the issue. And I don't know, I'm going to put you on the spot there, Scott, if you have any thoughts about that offhand, or if you don't want to say anything, that's fine. Oh, you just put your hand up, so go ahead, go for
it. Sure, thank you, Jim. Scott Hollenbeck here. First, I'd like to say I do support this proposal. It's actually something, a suggestion I made on the list several weeks ago, basically because I agree with your assessment that
There are some places in 9083 where the wording is a little inconsistent. You've got the one example there where there's one example that talks about the string lunarnic being used as an identifier. Another example uses lunarnic level 0. Those examples should be consistent. And I'm actually going to suggest a slight change to this proposal in that we should change lunarnic to lunarnic level 0, because RDAP itself is identified with the identifier RDAP level 0. But it's just for the sake of consistency, right? I think they should be the same. And there's also one other place in 9083 where it talks about these identifiers as those that are returned in the RDAP conformance data structure as being a hint. I think that word hint is a little bit soft and potentially leads to questions of interpretation and confusion. And so I've got a sentence in mind that I'm thinking about that I'll probably throw out to the list, or in the creation of an erratum report for this. So we will have something to discuss on list in terms of the way the erratum is processed. And so for people, yeah, if you're wondering, well, how is that processed? Someone actually, goes to the RFC editor webpage and fills out a little report saying, hey, I think I have found a technical issue with this RFC, right? They describe it in detail, and then that report is sent, among other places, to the working group mailing list, where the suggestion for the correction, and the merits of that can be discussed. So, this isn't just a slam dunk. One person says something and then the RFC editor is noting a change someplace. We will still have an opportunity for discussion. And as I said, I think changing that word hint to something a little bit stronger and less open to interpretation is one other place where we should probably look at 9083.
So thank you for that. Let me first say that I certainly take your friendly amendment of reversing my suggested errata thing here. That's fine. I think that it is important to make the examples consistent. And your suggestion about the hint mechanism, well, I see Antoine came in the queue here. There was a discussion that he and I were having as we got into all of this about RDAP conformance. I'm sure he's going to ask that question, so why don't you go ahead and do that?
No, I actually want to have a different question, and the question is actually directed to James, because what we're trying to do here is that what we said about the versioning is that the extensions at the moment don't have a method for versioning. But the comment that James made was, and they made it again now in the chat room, is that he wanted to ensure that the versioning of the policy identifiers, that they have versioning. And I think there's no question about that, right? So you thought, Jim, that we wanted to have a discussion about versioning of extensions. But I think the versioning of policy identifiers is without any discussion, right? And I see Scott first in the queue. So Scott, go ahead.
Thanks, Antoine. Scott Hollenbeck. Yes, I should also note, I do support the idea of having a discussion around version negotiation, right? And I will note that there actually is text right now in 9083. If you look at the description of the help response, it does say that among the other information that can be returned is information describing extensions. Now, unfortunately, that's as far as it goes, which means there's an awful lot of room there to interpret, well, what exactly does extension identification look like? But I think that does mean we have, I don't know if I'd want to call it a foundation, but at least we have a rough idea of where we might look for a possible method and a mechanism to add these kinds of capabilities to RDAP.
So before you sit down and step away, the question that I thought Antoine was going to ask is, he and I got into this discussion about why does RDAP conformance even exist? Because it doesn't seem to have, there's no material processing requirement on the part of a response or a client. And so the only real purpose that it had, as far as we could tell, was about the help, because in principle, the suggestion is that all of the extension identifiers in use or supported would be listed there. So that's its only real existence. But it's interesting that all the examples say that RDAP conformance must exist.
Right.
But there's nothing that says what you're supposed to do with whatever's in there. And then, as you just said, you've got the hint question.
Right.
So it all just came to that larger question. Do you want to comment at all on that, or?
Yeah, sure. Because 9083 does also say that, in the context of returned values, of an extension that for example, a client might not recognize, this is why extensions register and use these identifiers. They are intended to tell a client that, hey, here is, for example, a data structure that does not exist in the core spec. And you can match the prefix on this data structure to the identifiers that returned in the RDAP conformance section to tell you where the specification for how to process that extension exists.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, maybe I'm not expressing myself well. That's not getting to the question I'm asking. As I understand it, even when the server provides the response, it doesn't have to tell you what extensions that it used, because that's an option. And so, and in fact, a client can simply ignore objects it doesn't recognize, right? An extension it doesn't recognize. So the presence of RDAP conformance, except for the help thing where I'm trying to find out what a server does, it doesn't seem to serve any purpose, any material purpose, and as documented in
yeah,
the
I mean, I think the intention of that RDAP conformance data structure is that the server should return information describing all of the specifications that are represented in that response, to include, RDAP level 0, core RDAP, and any other extension that is represented in the response. And the intention is not that that is an optional thing.
Right. But now we're back to being a hint on the client side. But all that's fine. Okay. I think that as long as they're unique, they can be registered. Oh. Oh, it exists so a client can know which query parameters to use when sending the request. Well, sure. That makes sense to me, Andy, in the sense that a client would do a help request to find out what's available, and then it could go do things. Then it would know what to do. So I do understand the idea that in the help response, the RDAP performance would list all the extensions. It's just interesting that it's also there in all responses, and it's suggested that it can be there, but it does not seem to have any material value in a response, strictly speaking. It's just a hint, so to speak. That's just an observation. I guess it's not really a complaint. Okay, Jim Gould, you've been waiting quite patiently. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, unusual for me to be patient. So, yeah, I just want to ensure that we don't disallow versioning of the policy identifiers. That's all. So, as I understand it, that versioning is not a feature of RDAP, and that the registrations of extension and the structure of those extensions will not include version, or don't have to. But as long as we also don't disallow the inclusion of a versioned policy identifier, I think I'm fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that made sense to me, and I'm okay with that. But Rick is jumping up to the queue.
Sure, I was.
Although Scott was first, but now that you're there, go ahead.
Go ahead. Thanks, Rick. Scott Hollenbeck. Yeah, Jim, I agree with you completely. Right? I mean, we already have registered identifiers in the IANA registry. For example, the RDAP profile that was developed by ICANN. And there is nothing that modifies in the context of changing data structures in response. Right? It's all about what a server does in terms of constructing the response within the confines of standard 95 already. Right? So it tells the client, hey, this is kind of what you can expect, in terms of your response and how it's constructed. But as I said, nothing was extended. It's really more of a processing oriented thing. And yes, I want to make sure that we continue to allow that for very important reasons, that this is definitely needed from a policy perspective.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Okay, so I think the proposal here to just, stick with these things are unique identifiers, and they match one-to-one between the RDAP conformance element object and the RDAP extension identifiers. They're just opaque strings. As far as the protocol is concerned, then there's a one-to-one mapping there, and it's always a unique specification that the extension identifier maps to. And all of those extension identifiers need to be unique. And so we're just gonna stick with that, and that's where we're gonna go. So the proposal here about the errata, that's fine. Wherever you take that, Scott, and that goes to the list, and that'll get properly reviewed. And so that's fine. And George, go ahead, please.
So just George Michelson, AP Nick, just so I understand the formalism, we don't make decisions in rooms, right? So what you're saying is this is the chair's making a proposal. It's going to the list. You're seeking consensus on a chair proposal.
Thank you, George, for reminding me that I should be a little more careful about that. Very good. Yes. We certainly want to make sure in the minutes that all this is captured, and we should close out the discussion. There are multiple threads on the mailing list. Should try and pull all of them together with a closing message, which points to this discussion and these slides and what we're going to do. So that's where we'll end up. Okay. Any other comments or questions about this? Not seeing anything else in the room here. Let me just take a quick look through the chat here at the end. Thank you, Andy. That hint was bad language. Yes. I think there are just a couple of interesting things. It's amazing what turns up as one goes through this process over the years. And thank you for supporting the proposal. Okay. So we are all good. I think with that, Antoine, I'll just turn this back to you here.
Yes, I'm trying to preload the slides, but I think you first need to drop yours. Yeah, right. Okay, share, because I think that was the last piece of our agenda, or at least we have 8 minutes left for any other business. Does anybody have any other business?
I'll just comment in general. I mean, as Antoine had said in the beginning there are several documents which people were holding back because they wanted to make sure that we resolve this question of these things. And so we're hopeful that all of those are going to move along here quite smartly. There's a couple of them that we really do want and need going forward. And George, you should be raising your hand in the queue, really.
Yeah. Screw the queue. So,
George,
I don't often do this, but I would like to thank the chairs for their intervention into what has been a difficult conversation, almost acrimonious. And I think you added a lot of value. I think you helped. So thank you.
Well, thank you, George. I know that I certainly appreciate that. I see Antoine nodding too. It was tough for us. He and I had several hours of conversation trying to figure out where to take this and what to do with it. So thank you for that. It certainly was a difficult topic and difficult thing to do. So, but yeah, so just an outreach to the authors of those other 4 documents. Please do take this opportunity to make sure that you are aligned with all of this. I think a couple of them have a little bit of wording changes, editorial work to do, and then let's move them along. I think I'm most interested in the RDAP, in the redacted document myself. Would like to see that one move along very quickly. That's just a personal observation. But there are quite a number of them. People should push them out as quick as they can. Jim Gould, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I wanted to speak about the redacted draft. Where we do have a dependency on the JSON path draft. That's not an RFC. Yeah, I believe they have a milestone going out to November. So I believe we're going to have to wait for that. Just want to bring that up.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sorry, I was sort of taking over the cue from Antoine, but go ahead,
Yeah.
Scott.
Go ahead, Scott.
Thank you, guys. Scott Hollenbeck again. So yeah, just bringing the proposal conversation to closure. Antoine, if I think I heard you correctly, one of you will send a note to the list, like
Yes.
just echoing what George had said, say, hey, look, this is what we discussed in the room. This is the proposal. And the idea would be that working group members would, comment on the proposal at this point. Right?
Yes. So
that will
we can
give you
declare
the
consensus.
Right. The idea will be that it'll give you an opportunity to measure the consensus of our approach to the proposal. Okay, so jumping ahead just a little bit, if we do agree that we have consensus on adopting that proposal, I will volunteer to craft the errata report for 9083. All right, but I will wait until I get the go-ahead from you that, yes, we have consensus on this approach.
Yeah. And thank you for that, Scott. But I think what I just understood from you, it's not 1983 that needs an update, but it's actually 7480, right? Because you wanted to change Lunarnic into Lunarnic level 0.
No. That actual example with the Lunarnic stuff, it's an example in 9083, Antoine.
Okay. Then it's in that
And-
right,
and-
probably.
Yeah, and that hint wording is also in 9083. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't something someplace else. I just haven't seen anything anyplace else that I think rises to the level of adding to this confusion that we've had.
Okay, because when we were discussing this, we saw that the extension identifier for Lunarnic is in RFC 7480, section 8.1, and so that's where we thought all the confusion came from. There's one RFC that talks about Lunarnic as an extension, and there's another RFC that says Lunarnic level 0 as an extension. But okay, thank you. No, you're right. We will draft a conclusion for this discussion. We will send it to the mailing list, and thank you very much for volunteering to do the errata that are needed after we reach consensus. And since we have 3 minutes left, I ask again, do we have any other business? If not, then we are perfectly on time, and it's time for me to go to sleep. I want to thank everybody else as well, especially for the people there who still have a whole day ahead of them. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thanks all.
And thank you to Richard for taking the minutes.
Yep, thank you. All right. Yeah, I know. This one, I mean, I guess I can turn it off, but yeah.